Today we have Irene Takahashi. Um, and Irene, building on a solid foundation of 40 plus years of trial experience, is a litigator and as a litigator and judge. Irene Takahashi, excuse me, Irene Takahashi is one of the Bay Area's leading neutrals at ADR Services. Beyond her legal acumen, she has earned a reputation for being able to identify and facilitate the resolution of complex personal concerns that often form the most formidable barriers to settlements. Rather than having a set pattern for mediation, Irene has a style that allows her to shift gears as conditions develop and as unforeseen difficulties arise. Her adaptability provides the parties the maximum opportunity for resolution. Both litigants and litigators agree that she listens carefully, demonstrates human concern with a dignity that inspires confidence, and provides legal and practical guidance of substantial value. As one attorney put it, Irene's perceptive instincts made the difference. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Marianne Kim. Dr. Kim is a licensed clinical psychologist in San Francisco who received her Ph.D. from the University of California at Berkeley in clinical psychology. The focus of her practice is on neuropsychology and diagnostic evaluations, primarily in civil and criminal cases in both state and federal courts. She has consulted with the state bar for 5 years on ADA compliance and has testified on a variety of cases, including employment law, personal injury, and disability matters. Over the past 30 years, in addition to her private practice, she has been a professor at UC Berkeley, UC Santa Cruz, and San Jose State in psychology, ethnic studies, American studies, women's studies, and Asian American studies. With her background in race, class, and psychology, she brings a unique perspective to elimination of bias. And with that, I am happy to turn it over to you, Irene and Dr. Kim. I will turn off my video and you have the floor.
Thank you, Katie.
You know, one of the most significant aspects of practicing law in an increasingly global economy, as communities grow more multi-ethnic and multicultural each day, is the challenge of sustained interactions between people who are different from us in various ways. Even the simplest of encounters can leave lawyers, paralegals, or clients feeling confused, frustrated, or offended, even when everyone's intentions are the best. So, identifying one's own blind spots has a real and practical effect on how we conduct ourselves in our personal relationships, in our workplace, and in court. Marianne, why do we all have biases? And is it really reasonable to expect that we can eliminate them, or is the best we can do to recognize and deal with them as they occur?
I mean, I think it takes a bit of introspection for someone to recognize the type of biases they have and that the biases come from your upbringing and the environment that you've been raised in. Um, you know, stereotypes, bias are shortcuts for analyzing data around us, crowds, people, you know, situations, and those are shortcuts. But, you know, with those shortcuts, there isn't an understanding or recognition that there's variability. There are people that don't fit that mold. And, you know, the person, you know, the Latin person walking down your street is not necessarily in a cleaning service or landscaping. But those are the biases. Those are the immediate go-to things. And, you know, frankly, do we have the time to really explore who everybody is? Probably not. I mean, that would be exhaustive. But I do think that it's important to have the insight that there is bias, that there are, you know, and it's not just race, it's also classism, you know, that, you know, we have certain views on things that come from our education, our class, our privilege, and, you know, position in life. Most people believe that they're in positions in life because they earned it, not looking at luck, not looking at timing, But you know, we have a belief that there is a meritocracy. We work hard, we will get ahead. It's not true for most people,
Thank
but the
you.
people on the top believe that. So,
You
but
know,
as far as elimination of bias, I think it, you know, the first step is to recognize that there is bias. And from there, we can have a discussion and work towards some change. Sorry, that's a long-winded response.
well, thank you. Thank you. You know, I just want to share the fact that when I was asked to do this presentation, I thought about it for a couple of days because I have been attending elimination of bias MCLEs ever since they were first presented, not only because I have an interest in the topic, but they're kind of fun and interesting. And I've been thinking when I was asked, what can I do that's different? Um, I've noticed that a lot of the seminars are very well researched, very well presented, but they seem to deal with bias at an arm's length. And what I'm going to try to do today is take a little personal risk. I would like to share with you some experiences I had beginning as a child as a way of attempting to communicate how, when I experienced negative bias, how it affected me, and how I felt, and how I chose to deal with it or not at the time. And I want to say first off that I am not here to say that the way I dealt with things was right. I'm not here to say that everyone should speak up. It depends on who you are, what the circumstances are, what risks you may be taking. And I'm certainly not here to um, receive validation. I just want to try to communicate how it felt. And I'm also going to talk, as opposed to other lectures that I've attended recently, my goal was never to get anyone in trouble. I chose not to report people to the state bar or the Commission on Judicial Performance. I just wanted to be treated the same, and I wanted the offensive conduct to cease. So I will share with you about a month ago when I was talking about my intentions and how I wanted to present to a dear friend of mine who happens to be from Hawaii. He's part Japanese, part Chinese descent. And as I was relating to him some of my ideas, as he has said before, he shook his head, tossed his hand, and said, "Oh, Irene, you're just too sensitive. You're too sensitive." And you know, at the time, I said something different that I'd said before because he said that to me before. And I said, "You know, I don't think I'm too sensitive. I think you're insensitive." And I looked up the word sensitive just to do a little reality check. And I found two general definitions. One was easily damaged, injured, or distressed by slight changes. I think that's what he was saying to me. But I like the definition that says having or displaying a quick and delicate appreciation of other people's feelings. And I'm wondering if we shouldn't change the definition or the description of being sensitive to being empathetic. Now, what I hope to do today is to share with you a couple of the experiences I've encountered. Um, and I want to emphasize again, whether you're a young attorney, a supervising attorney, associate, partner, your experience will be necessarily different from mine. But I want to start with a little backdrop to my experience of bias. And as my name and appearance suggest, I am of Japanese ancestry. My father was born in Tokyo, Japan, and came to America for an education. My mother, who's 104, was born in Palo Alto, California. Her parents did come from Japan to make a new life in America. And I was born in San Francisco, and we lived in an apartment house on California Street, not far from Japantown. But when my father got his first job in Oakland, we moved across the bay to El Cerrito. I moved into what was essentially a white community. And on my block, the builder had, after getting the written consent of Caucasians on both sides of this block, that it was okay to sell to Japanese people. He did. And so my neighborhood growing up was very diverse. There were Japanese and Chinese, Italian, Caucasian, and we all played together and we had a great childhood. Um, I, I also want you to understand that being born and raised Asian, I think my experience was similar to many Asian kids. There were some rules that were instilled in me early in life. One of them was you must respect your parents, your teachers, your elders, and authority figures, which, let's face it, that's just about everyone. Secondly, it is arrogant and rude to challenge or question people that are in higher positions than you and that you don't agree with. The message was, don't make waves. Another lesson was my father used to say, utilize your potential to the best of your ability. Be thankful for the opportunity that you have been given and work hard to prove yourself and perhaps prove them wrong. As a minority, you have to work harder. You have to be better in order to even begin to hope that you will be treated equally. And lastly, education is the key because once obtained, they can never take it from you. I think we need to take a little look at American history. And as I heard on the radio the other day, our country was essentially founded on racism, whether it was the treatment of Native Americans, the introduction of slavery into our country, or the removal of people of Japanese ancestry during World War II by virtue of Executive Order 9066, signed into law by Franklin D. Roosevelt on February 19, 1942. There had been longstanding racism against Japanese and Japanese Americans, and it was motivated by jealousy in part over their economic success. They had come from Japan, took farmland that wasn't profitable and made it profitable. My parents and my mother's parents were rounded up and given 48 hours to leave everything behind, their homes, their cars, their jobs. And they could only take what they could carry. And they were removed from the West Coast, first to Santa Rita racetrack, where my parents were housed in a horse stall with a rope and an army blanket separating their apartment from another couple's apartment. And my mother said that she could still remember the stench from the horse manure that at least was swept out before they arrived. But then they were removed to Manzanar, where they were euphemistically called, I say, relocation camps. I don't consider it to be a camp when you're housed in very crude barracks, very little medical care, dietary restrictions were not observed. And there was a fence around the barracks and barbed wire, and the whole compound was guarded by sentry towers with armed guards. Many people lost businesses and loved ones as a result. And my parents never talked about what happened to them. And as a child, I figured it was because it was too painful for them. And so I never dared ask them questions about the internment. But later, as I've included in some of the written materials, there's an article that was written by a couple that came to my parents' home, and I sat on the floor and listened to questions and answered that I dared not ask. So I recommend it to you for a personal glimpse into what their wartime experience was. Marianne, do people need to care about the experiences of others before we can begin to eliminate bias? And how does empathy play a part?
I mean, it's a great question. I think, I don't think you necessarily have to experience another person's experience. I do think if you are conscious enough to understand, like, for example, if you're a woman and you're in a man's field, what that feels like, when he's picked over you, or, you know, even in my field in forensics, it's, you know, I'm the only, on the San Francisco panel for the Superior Court, I am the only non-white person. I'm one of two women, and that's even recent that we got the other woman because I brought her in because she speaks Spanish, you know. But my point is, you know, I don't think you necessarily have to do that. I think you can go back to your own experience of what it was like, and it may be even, you know, when you're traveling and you're in a country and everybody's Muslim and there's a mosque going off, or, you know, even if you're in Rome and you're, you know, everyone's Catholic and you're not. I mean, that experience of being the other, the experience of not, but more, you know, in terms of you know, professional stuff, you know, we've all been in positions where we have less power. And even if it's, you know, the CHP guy that pulls you over, you know, that you have less power in that situation. But if you can really appreciate and understand that, and then generalize what that must feel like to the other person, to not have power, to not have choice, to have limited choices. And so I think from there, you know, you can begin a discussion from understanding. I mean, I'm not saying that, you know, every, you know, white male privileged person must, you know, we must put them in, you know, Beijing to for a year to experience what that's like. I think you can pull from other experiences. And from there you can talk about, have a real discussion about bias.
Well, you know, I'd like to move to my early childhood, when I was in elementary school. And my childhood was awkward and a bit confusing at times. I remember in elementary school, we studied World War II. And quite frankly, I was always happy that it seemed to be at the end of the year and there wasn't much time to study it, because it seemed like the history lesson began with, and then they bombed Pearl Harbor in a sneak attack. And I remember as a child hoping and praying that no one's father or uncle was killed by a Japanese soldier because they would hate me. I thought at the time how my parents had done nothing wrong, and yet they were put in prison. And all I wanted to do was to be treated the same. You know, even Halloween was a bit difficult for me. I don't know about you, but in elementary school, the kids could wear their costumes to school, and we would have a parade, the Halloween parade, and we would march around the school round, and everybody get to see everybody else's costume. But I was in a school with 6 Asian kids, no other kids of color. And my mother loved Halloween parade day because she would dress her little girl in a pretty red kimono. And I hated it. I didn't dare tell her, but I didn't want to stand out as being different. I wanted to be the same. I think I would have been much happier being Annie Oakley in a cowgirl outfit. I had a boyfriend in the 2nd grade, and his name was Brian Nichols. And I used to go to his house after school. So what are we, 7 or 8 years old? And his mother would make the most delicious hot fudge. And recently I had an opportunity to reminisce about those days. And I asked him, did you know you were my boyfriend when we were 7 or 8? And he said, kinda. And I told him about my memories of the fudge, and he said that he remembered coming to my house. And I said, I don't remember what happened. And he said that I took him to my bedroom and I showed him a pair of special ballet slippers. I didn't know what he was going to say. And then afterwards, he told me that he went home and he asked his mother, can a Japanese girl marry a Caucasian boy? And his mother said, well, it's not common, but it's okay. Marianne, can you talk about the role parents play in bias? And would you agree that children, at least initially, are not born with prejudices?
No, I mean, parents play a pivotal role in interpreting all the data that's presented, who that person is, I remember when my son was 2 years old and, we saw a homeless person and he said to me, is he shopping? And I said, no, he's homeless. Why is he homeless? I said, because he's unlucky. But I got to interpret for him what that meant. And parents do this all the time, with the books you read, with your, community, your friends, your activities. They interpret all sorts of data. Just as an aside, I went to this grand rounds on, you know, um, children watching a lot of violence on TV, and they said, or videos, and they said that the best thing is for a parent to sit with their kid watching a horror movie, so they can interpret for them, what does all this mean? And parents talk about sex and about drugs and about all sorts of things, and they have a perception, they have an interpretation of what all that means, and that is what builds in a child, and that child then takes that into the world and tests out the parent's interpretation. Just as an aside, this was sort of interesting for me. I was reading an article, a study about bias, and how do kids learn about this. And they said that in a study with college freshmen, when they put a white college freshman with a black college freshman versus two white freshmen, the elimination of bias and understanding about race relations increased because they had that experience of being with somebody from a different ethnic culture. Now, they're probably, if they're in college, from the same class, but they're not the same color. So based on that experience, now that's not something they got from their parents, but based on that experience, there was an understanding about bias.
Thank you. How about this one? Another childhood experience. I happen to believe, I'm not a psychologist, that one's childhood experiences really make us who we are today and how we deal with it. But regardless, I had a next door neighbor in El Cerrito. His name was Randy Carlson. And Randy and his sisters and parents went to church every Sunday, and they invited me to go to Sunday school. And I remember sitting in these little chairs facing the Sunday school teacher, listening to Bible stories, when suddenly I felt my head jerking backwards a couple of times. Somebody was pulling my hair, and I turned around to see what this was about. And I looked into the faces of two little boys doing one of these. Ching Chong Chinaman, Ching Chong Chinaman. I was crushed. I went home and I told my parents that I didn't want to go to church anymore. And I told them what happened. And I remember saying, and I'm not even Chinese. Marianne, can you speak to the tendency of non-Asians to lump us into one group? You are Korean ancestry, I am Japanese, but maybe you can discuss how the current pandemic illustrates how feelings and hate crimes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I first learned about it when my son was telling me that Uber drivers wouldn't pick up anybody with an Asian last name. They just refused to. And I was like, wow. And, I've been reading these studies, and even the United Nations human relations, or they did a study, and they're finding that even, Australian Asians are getting, discriminated against. And because they do see that they think that we're all alike. And it's the same, during the time of internment, they tried to take Chinese people into the internment camps too, not understanding it's a totally different culture. But, you know, and with each Asian ethnicity, a lot of the difference has to do with how they enter into the country, how they, and under what circumstances, and that shapes things. I'll just give a little example. Koreans, the way that they kind of are allowed to immigrate in is if they belong to a church, or they are part of a parish, and they can come, they can immigrate, they can get their green cards, they can get citizenship. And so a lot of the Korean cultures are around churches. Not that the Koreans are necessarily that religious. I mean, they're Buddhist, but in terms of how they came to the U.S. and an Asian or any immigrant that comes to America is just by that action a different person than the people that stayed. You know, they're coming for education, they're coming for opportunity. They're a different type of person. That immigrant is a different type of person. They have hope. So, you know, I think, I mean, by the way, as a psychologist, I'll just tell you, I think it's painful that children are so cruel, but children do pick up on, you know, what their parents tell them, what's allowed, and some of that behavior is something that they see modeled at home. So I don't necessarily believe in bad kids. I do believe in bad parenting.
Okay.
Okay, I just put it out there. Okay, I will not judge anymore.
You know, when I got a little older and did some more independent study about the historical injustice in our country, and particularly to the Asian experience in America, I did go back to my mom and I did ask her a question. And I hadn't asked her about her wartime experience until then. But I said to her, Mom, you know, when our government said that you had to go and be relocated and go into these internment camps, why didn't you protest? Why didn't you fight? Why did you go? And she looked at me very solemnly and, to my chagrin, said, You don't understand. In those days, we didn't have political representation. And the only way we could prove that we were loyal Americans was to do what our government told us to do. So the message that I gleaned from that was, in certain circumstances, all you can do is do what you're told, work hard, and perhaps prove them wrong. But I'll tell you, you know, having gone to public school, high school in Richmond, Berkeley as an undergrad, and UC Davis Law School, during a time of affirmative action where doors were being opened where they had previously been shut to people of color, I actually didn't experience my first sort of slap in the face with racism until my first job as a young deputy DA in Alameda County. And I remember sitting in the law library, that's when you researched with books, sitting in the law library along with some other trial attorneys. And I heard someone walk in. It turned out to be Captain Bernard, who was in charge of the DA investigators. And he started talking about the Japs this and the Japs that. And I looked up because I thought he might be talking to me, and I don't think he even saw me. But it happened to be the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And I remember that my first and only thought after hearing the word Jap, it wasn't my experience, but I was hearkening back to what my parents had been through, and I was crushed again. And I just remember thinking, I don't belong here. That was my first honest thought. And I confided in a supervising attorney who went on to be a judge in Contra Costa. But I told him what happened. I guess he could tell I was upset. Unbeknownst to me, he went to the DA, D. Lowell Jensen, and told him what happened. And within very short time, I was called to the DA's office. And sitting across from the desk, the DA apologized for the conduct of Captain Bernard. And he asked me if I wanted a personal apology. of course, at that time, all I wanted to do was to disappear. And yet, as I look back on that, those were two people in a position of power, certainly more than mine as a first year attorney out of law school. Can you talk, Marianne, about how this unbalanced power dynamic may play a part in and how other people might speak up on somebody else's behalf?
Yeah. I mean, you and I have had this discussion. I think it's an interesting one. Um, you know, I went off on this tangent at one point about philanthropy and how, you know, you know, people have to have all their needs met before they're altruistic or philanthropic. And if you are in a position of power, if you have much more latitude to make changes, to speak out, so on and so forth. And I think, you know, when you do the calculus of do you speak up? Do you, you know, tell somebody that you're upset? Do you share what happened, you know, an injustice that happened, you know, and you have to see how much you have at stake. Because if you're a young, you know, woman of color at a predominantly white law firm, do you say something, you know, versus if you're at the top of the food chain and you're the top trial attorney and the biggest rainmaker, of course you can talk up, you can say, hey, this is what happened, it's unacceptable and I want change, otherwise I'm leaving, you know, because you have a lot more power. So I mean, I think part of it is to do the calculus of, you know, where are you financially, emotionally, you know, where you are as far as your career in terms of speaking up or to try to create some change. Um, that said, I think also, even if you don't have power, that, you know, you can sort of create a community, a safe harbor, if you will, of other like-minded, let's say, uh, young associates who may have more, be raised by feminist mothers who understand about race and class, and then maybe that's where the change starts. I don't know. I mean, there are many ways that you can approach this issue, but I think in the calculation you have to see what's at stake. I've seen this, I've done a couple class actions, glass ceiling cases, and I see with women, you know, that for them, they have to figure out, what's at stake before they say anything. And, if they're in a lawsuit, in a class action, their career is over. And they have to take that into the calculus before they join the lawsuit.
Let me talk about some of my experiences once I made the switch from criminal law and had already been on the bench to when I started as a relatively new associate at a mid-sized firm in Oakland, a civil firm. Um, it was, like I said, in the 1990s. And let me tell you something. Experiences back then were so different from now. There was really, and as you'll see, explicit bias as opposed to implicit bias. We've heard a lot about that lately, the microaggressions, so to speak. And that's not to say that because we call it micro, that they're any less harmful. But anyway, um, I was in this firm, I had been hired by one of the name partners, and it was his 50th birthday. And we, that is his trial team, were invited to his home along with other members of the firm and clients. And the senior partner that I was being supervised with was taking clients around and introducing them to his trial team. And on his trial team were three of us Asians. There was Daryl, my friend from Hawaii, Tony Ho, who was born in Hong Kong, and myself, and about 4 or 5 other Caucasian men and women. And as my senior partner went around and introduced me, and then he introduced Daryl, but when he got to Tony, he said, and this is Tony Ho, the Chinaman on my team. I was shocked. I looked at Tony. I looked at Daryl. Neither of them seemed to react, but their eyes were downcast. And I thought about it over the weekend, and it so troubled me that when I returned to the office on Monday, I went straight to Daryl and I said, "Did you hear what he said about Tony?" And Daryl said, "Oh, that's just name." Um, and I said, "No, it's wrong. It's wrong." So I went to the senior partner and I said, I was really offended by how you referred to Tony as a Chinaman. And I knew right away that he knew what I was talking about because immediately he said, "Well, he was born in China." And I said, "That's really beside the point. The term Chinaman is a racist term. It's tantamount to you calling me a Jap." And that's what I said at the time. Um, this was, by the way, the same partner, and I've told you times are better, but this was the same partner that was trying to, and I was grateful at the time, trying to teach another woman and myself, my coworker, how to do marketing, client development. And he was going to take us along to a client lunch. And we were sitting in front of his desk, and he picked up the phone to confirm the date and time and the luncheon with the client. And just before he hung up, he said, "Oh, by the way, I'm bringing along 2 bimbos." And she and I looked at each other. We knew that he was just trying to get under our skin and deliberately said that to get us riled up. And it did, because we both, again, in a rather lighthearted manner, but we did jump on him verbally and let him know in no uncertain terms that we found it offensive. Now, one more story about this person, who, by the way, is still a friend. I had been asked to draft a mediation brief for his signature as a senior associate. And I recall the case involved a small Black child, a little boy, who was probably 2 or 3. And he was running down a concrete walkway at his apartment. It was a 2nd floor apartment. And one of the bars, metal bars, that was part of the fencing that would protect someone from falling onto the asphalt pavement below was missing. And this child stumbled, fell through the bars onto the asphalt pavement below, and miraculously, after being kept in the hospital, running all kinds of tests and such, he did not suffer a broken bone or a head injury. And now 2 years later, he was about 4.5, had not gone to kindergarten yet. And the attorney for this child was an African-American attorney, and he was arguing a substantial future wage loss. And I, in the brief, addressed it by saying words to the fact that the child hadn't even started school, and it was pure speculation about this wage loss. Now, my partner called me in to his office, and he said he liked the brief, but he wanted me to augment my argument about the speculative wage loss. But he wanted me to insert some language to the effect that said, well, this was a Black child from Oakland, and his chances of having economic success were diminished by virtue of who he was, quite frankly. And I was most offended by that. I went back to my office and I thought about it. I went back to his office and I said 2 things. One, number one, I don't think that if I change the brief the way you want me to, that it would promote settlement. And secondly, if I make these changes, I am taking my name off the brief. I went back to my office, started making the changes, and a minute later, there was a knock on my door. My partner walked in and he said, "Don't change the brief and leave your name on it." So that to me was some modicum of progress. Marianne, I recently attended an interactive elimination of bias seminar, and one woman said, "I am so tired of trying to educate people. If they don't get it by now, they never will." Can you talk about whether you feel there's actually some social value in attempting to eliminate bias?
I think part of it is if people of color or people who are disenfranchised in any way. It could be class, also cultural. You know, you could be Muslim. I mean, there's. I think if there's an collective understanding that we all suffer from this, you know, if it's, you know, women in the workplace, that we all are in this together. We all have issues. We all have, you know, glass ceilings. We all have that. We have limited opportunities, you know, like this, you know, Black child that you know, the case that you were working on is, you know, and I think it is offensive to say that, you know, his life is worth less than somebody else's. And I think that inherently that kind of argument, it's a slippery slope. You know, that's Nazi Germany, and we don't want to go there, you know, to think that one person is more valuable than another. But, you know, as far as, you know, educating others, I mean, I've gone through this also, you know, when I was in college, you know, to, you know, be part of the demographic of, you know, non-white students, that I'm there for the white students, for their, you know, cultural experience, that is offensive. The school was advertised in part that way, but my point is, you know, I think, you know, when you take a step back and understand that we all suffer from this, that, you know, so taking a stance, speaking up, you know, being outraged, asking for changes, negotiating on these things to make it a different experience for yourself, but also for other people, you know, that they get the fruits of your intervention. So I think that, you know, and to understand there is definitely a ripple effect.
Okay. Well, what do you do if a judge is the offender? And I will recount to you an experience I had with a judge that I was actually quite fond of, Judge John Minnie. And I saw Judge Minnie quite a bit as a DA in Contra Costa because you appear in front of some of the same judges over and over. Always liked him. And one day I was arguing a motion before Judge Minnie against a defense counsel, another woman, and we were going back and forth a little bit. It was getting a little heated, as attorneys tend to do. And all of a sudden, the judge effectively cut us off by saying, now, ladies, now, ladies. And he made his ruling. I can't remember what it was, but it bothered me. And so I went to talk to him after court. And I told him in chambers that what he said troubled me. And he cocked his head and seemed sincerely interested. And I said, I kind of felt that you were treating us like you were watching a cat fight. And I wondered whether you would have reacted the same way and cut us off if there were two men arguing before you, or whether you would have actually appreciated and expected a spirited discussion. And he looked at me very sincerely and he paused and he said, you know, thank you for pointing that out to me. You're right. And my esteem and respect for him, again, off the charts. Now, contrast that with an experience I had not long before I left my firm. It was in front of another judge in Contra Costa, one that I did not know as well. And it must have been before court call because we were sitting, it was a CMC, and we're sitting in court waiting for the bailiff to call everyone to order and the judge to take the bench. And I remember sitting there and looking out. I was sitting in the jury box at the time and looking out and seeing so many Asian attorneys and clients. And I just thought, boy, this is so different than when I started out. And I was very pleased. Of course, they were all much younger than myself. Long story short, the judge took the bench and decided as a courtesy to call the case, I think, with the most attorneys. And I saw the Asian attorneys and their clients sitting next to them. And at first the judge was having difficulty pronouncing the Vietnamese names. So he came across a really good idea, and he asked each attorney to stand with his client and introduce the client. So that went on and all was fine. And then the judge asked everyone to be seated. And he wanted to tell a story from his past when he was a civil litigator. And then he would deal with the case. And he told the story about flying to Hong Kong with other attorneys for the deposition. And as attorneys do in deposition, they were going around the table asking the Chinese deponent questions. And at one point, the deponent said, I already answered that question, to which someone said, no, 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 that was Mr. Johnson. And the deponent replied, oh, all you Caucasian attorneys look alike. Well, the judge guffawed from the bench. I could hear some polite giggles. I looked at all the Asian attorneys and I wondered, am I being too sensitive? But perhaps because I thought I had success with the other judge, I decided to go talk to this judge after court in chambers. And I asked the bailiff if I could speak with the judge. I happened to know the bailiff from times past. And I asked him, he was African-American. I asked him, did you hear the story that the judge told this morning? To which his own bailiff said, Irene, report him, report him. He said, State Bar. He's a racist. He's a racist. And I said, that is not my intention. That is not why I'm here. So he let me in to speak with the judge, and I walked in and I introduced myself. And you see, I had been, before I was a judge, to judges orientation. And they told us in no uncertain terms that do not even let it, even slightly off color joke be told in chambers, because to allow it or to smile, God forbid to laugh, would be to condone its content. So I wondered maybe this judge didn't go to the same orientation. But the way I heard the joke, it was a flip on all you Asians look alike. And it bothered me. Now, granted, we have black hair and brown eyes, but I didn't think it was funny. So I wanted to gently suggest that the judge not tell that joke or that story in court again. Well, I sat down and I started to speak. And before I could get more than 2 sentences out, I just let him know that the story he told in court this morning was offensive. And I saw the color in his face. I mean, like red. And he slammed his hand on his desk and said in a very angry, harsh tone, that was a very funny story. And I don't need you to tell me what's funny and what's not. That was a very, very funny story. Well, I could tell I was making no progress. I tried to at least explain myself a little bit and tell him, Judge, I think you misinterpret my intentions in being here. And I backed out of his chambers, walked quickly to my car, jumped in my car, drove as quickly as I could to San Francisco, where I reported what happened to the managing partner, just in case the judge called to complain about me, and also to tell him that if he wanted to reassign this case to someone else, I would have no problem with that, because I didn't want my conduct to affect the outcome of the case, because the judge might take it out on our client. All these years I've been thinking that was sort of a failure on my part, but in thinking about it earlier today, I would just bet that judge didn't tell that story ever again in that court. In the interest of time, Marianne, I do have more questions, and I think the most challenging thing about preparing for this presentation was cutting out a lot of things and many more questions that I'd like to present to you. But like I said, in the interest of time, I'd just like to list some simple advice on having what I call difficult dialogues. Number one is this person really even worth talking to? And number two, is this someone that you care about? Is this someone you think actually has the capacity to hear what you have to say? If so, set realistic expectations of what you want from the conversation. And once the discussion is underway, think about whether the conversation is being helpful, but always be aware of yourself and your mental and physical well-being when having these conversations. Now, I've shared with you some things that happened to me, and I'm certain that none of you out there will have similar conversations or experiences because we're all different. But I've felt for a long time that you don't have to be of a certain group to understand that something is unjust, and you don't have to be a person in a marginalized group to recognize and call it out. I think it's really about learning to be empathetic to people and be aware and knowledgeable about this country's history. And in speaking about history, I remember the words of John Lewis, who said, and I quote, "When you see something that's not right, not fair, not just, you have to speak up. You have to say something. You have to do something." And with that, I think we have some time for question and answers. And also, at the conclusion, I have asked that 3 short clips lasting a total of 11 minutes be played. And they're actually stand-up comics. And the reason I think they're important is they deal with bias in their own way through humor. And I think the most important thing is to keep talking about it and dealing with it and not to give up. And in that way, we can move towards eliminating bias. So I think we have some questions. Katie?
Yes, we do indeed, Irene. A question that we received from David Murray is, should you attempt to counsel clients who exhibit racial bias?
Well, I'm not a litigator anymore, but Marianne, can you speak to that?
Well, I mean, I think you have to be clear as to what your objective is. Like, what are you trying to do? And I think throwing up a balloon at the beginning to see how open a person is important before you can't be too aggressive about it. I also think that if you get angry, basic human response is going to be defensive and to become more intractable in their position or the joke that they made or their perspective. And I know you know this in mediation too. I mean, there's actually social psychology studies about this, is that the more hyperbolic people are, the less likely toward resolution. And they have studies in the UN about countries go into war if they're more hyperbolic, but if they get into these shades of gray, then they're more likely to come to a solution. And I think if you can find a common ground, even if it's not talking about race, but if you're talking about, somebody in a position of authority abusing that, or, not being allowed in a certain club, I mean, we've all had those experiences. And, based on that commonality, I think you can kind of slowly segue into a real discussion about racial bias.
You have another question, Katie?
We do. From Elizabeth Tippin. She said, I, a woman, was presiding over a presiding where 2 men were arguing. I said, gentlemen, this sounds like a cat fight. The demeanor of both men changed and became more civil.
Of course.
Would you like to comment on this?
They don't want to be characterized as women. So, I mean, like, that's an insult. But, I mean, this is our culture. But good for you. You're changing the narrative.
We have another question or a comment from Sam Fraser that said, I would respectfully disagree with challenging the offending judge. I'm also of foreign descent, but when I'm in court, I'm an advocate only for my client and no other, not even myself. I speak only for the good of my client. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's why I chose to go in chambers and to speak on a personal level. With the one judge, I didn't consider it challenging. Actually, I didn't consider it challenging to either one. I came to them as a friend of the court, and I thought that our relationship was meaningful enough for me, that I just wanted to let them know that if it was offensive to me, it might be offensive to others. And I thought they would want to know it. But I didn't, as you would say, challenge the judge. I would never do that in open court. It's too personal. It's too risky, frankly.
Mhm. I don't know if you were here for the earlier presentation on competency, but Judge Murphy mentioned that sometimes it is an attorney's obligation to go on the record and mention something if they feel the judge is compromised. Do you feel there's any similar requirement as far as bias is concerned, or would that apply more to competency and be less appropriate here?
I guess I need to know a little bit more about the question. If to call it out on the bench, if the judge says something on the bench that is explicitly biased, that type of thing.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm sure I would. I think my demeanor would communicate a lot. Perhaps I would choose my words even more carefully.
Mhm.
Um, Maybe in terms of, Your Honor, I hope you don't mean to suggest that. Something like
Mhm.
that.
Okay, we have a couple of other questions from people speaking as white people, um, and as far as how they can serve as allies and how they can avoid unintentionally possibly being insensitive. So if I can just read these two quick questions. Um, there are times when I feel in retrospect as a white person that I have said something that unintentionally was possibly insensitive. Do you believe it is self-serving or helpful to go back to that person to discuss the situation? The second question is, many white people sincerely want to be allies, but they are viewed as having white savior complexes. Do you have any tips for white people to avoid looking like they have a white savior complex?
You know, I don't think that they get to choose what your intention is. If your intention is, I really want to understand it, I really want to help, you have to hang on to that. That's your intention. If the other person interprets it as a savior complex or you're too sensitive or whatever, that's them. That's not you. I mean, your intention comes from a really good and positive place. And I think it's important to hang on to that and not get swayed by, somebody else's projection that this is what you're really doing. It's like, I mean, you can check in and say, am I having this savior complex? But I think, at the end of the day, you're not. You're a well-meaning person. You're a kind person. You're trying. That's it. And I think it's important to hang on to that. Good for you for trying. Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kim. Thank you, Irene.